Historical patterns of psychological decomposition, control, psychiatric overreach, manufactured dangerousness, preventive control, and the modern expansion of surveillance and categorization and how it applies to the injustices to Kevin Perelman's life since a very young age. Historical patterns of psychological control, psychiatric overreach, manufactured dangerousness, and the modern expansion of surveillance and categorization. Psychological coercion, psychiatric overlabeling, social isolation, reputation damage, and the manufacture of dangerousness are not imaginary concepts. They are historically documented methods by which institutions, states, professional communities, and social systems have managed, discredited, neutralized, or confined people under the language of treatment, safety, morality, order, or public necessity. Across different societies and eras, the labels change, but the underlying mechanism remains recognizable. Define the target, isolate the target, reinterpret the target, and justify control over the target. The Stasi, the Spanish Inquisition, Soviet punitive psychiatry, COINTELPRO, and modern surveillance regimes all differ in structure and ideology, yet each shows that bureaucratic or institutional power can be used to classify, monitor, discredit, and restrict human beings while preserving the appearance of legitimacy. This paper uses the term containment as a broad interpretive concept for that pattern. The term is not being invented out of nothing. In psychoanalytic and psychodynamic thought, especially in work associated with Wilfred Bion, containment refers to a caregiving or therapeutic process of receiving, holding, and metabolizing overwhelming emotional experience. In that original sense, containment is supportive. Here, however, I use the term critically and inversely, not emotional holding, but coercive restriction, not care, but control, not helping a person regulate emotion, but narrowing that person's life through labeling, humiliation, provocation, isolation, surveillance, and social management. The historical systems most comparable to this negative sense did not always use that word, but they documented the method. The point here is not that Bion created a repression doctrine, but that an existing psychological term can be adapted to describe a recognizable pattern of social and institutional control. The historical record shows that coercive systems rarely present themselves as cruelty. They present themselves as necessity. They say they are preserving order, protecting society, preventing danger, defending morality, treating pathology, or managing risk. This is one reason such systems can be difficult for ordinary people to recognize. Many people assume oppression must look theatrical, openly violent, or foreign. In reality, some of its most durable forms work indirectly, through classification, stigma, emotional baiting, rumor, professional authority, and the manipulation of how a person is perceived by others. The injury can be real even when the outer surface looks bureaucratic, procedural, or reasonable. The asylum era and the authority of psychiatric classification. To understand modern psychological containment, it helps to begin with the older psychiatric system. Between about 1850 and 1950, mental hospitals expanded dramatically. Britannica notes that in the United States the state hospital population later fell from just under 560,000 in 1955 to just over 130,000 in 1980 as deinstitutionalization progressed. That rise and fall matters because it shows that large-scale psychiatric confinement was once not exceptional at all. It was a routine institutional framework. In that earlier era, psychiatric systems often operated with broader and less operationalized categories than later DSM-based practice. The power of the system did not depend only on precise diagnosis. It depended on institutional authority, family petitions, medical discretion, and a social willingness to treat labeled persons as unfit, unstable, deviant, or in need of segregation. This is not to say that all psychiatric care was malicious. It is to say that the structure itself allowed an enormous degree of custodial control over human beings. Deinstitutionalization did not arise out of nowhere. It arose partly because the older institutional model was overcrowded, restrictive, and heavily criticized. In the United States, the federal role in mental health also expanded after World War II. The National Mental Health Act of 1946 authorized federal work to improve the mental health of U.S. citizens through research into psychiatric disorders, and NIMH was established in 1949. That history matters because it reflects the increasing institutionalization of mental health knowledge and authority. Psychiatry and mental health administration did not remain small or local, they became more systematized, more bureaucratically connected, and more influential in public life. The legal shift, why dangerousness became central. A major turning point came when the law narrowed the grounds for involuntary confinement. In O'Connor v. Donaldson, 1975, the Supreme Court held that a state cannot constitutionally confine a non-dangerous person who is capable of surviving safely in freedom, alone or with the help of willing and responsible family or friends. In Addington v. Texas, 1979, the court held that involuntary civil commitment requires at least clear and convincing evidence. These cases did not eliminate coercion or abuse, but they changed the formal terrain. A broad label alone was no longer supposed to be enough. Dangerousness in evidence became far more important. That legal change has a crucial implication. Once easy confinement of a non-dangerous person becomes harder to justify, the strategic incentive changes. The problem for anyone seeking control is no longer merely how to describe the person as odd, flawed, embarrassing, or socially inconvenient. The problem becomes how to make the person seem dangerous. This is the key to understanding the idea of manufactured dangerousness. If the legal threshold depends on threat, then anything that creates, exaggerates, records, or performs threat becomes useful. Provocation, selective interpretation, humiliation, rumor, and the construction of a narrative in which the target's reactions are treated as proof. The more the law tightens, the more valuable appearances become. This also helps explain why reform by itself does not end abuse. A system can stop openly warehousing people under broad labels and still leave behind actors who dislike those limits, resent those reforms, or search for other ways to produce the same result. Even when the formal law changes, the informal drive to control, suppress, or discredit a person can survive. The tactic simply adapts. Instead of saying, "He is odd, therefore confine him," the method becomes, "Provoke him, reinterpret him, and make him appear threatening." That is how old custodial logic can persist inside a newer legal environment. This is an inference from the change in legal standards, not proof of one unified doctrine, but it is a historically coherent inference. DSM history, OCD, trichotillomania, and label inflation. The evolution of diagnostic language matters because labels carry authority. Yet labels are often used sloppily in ordinary life, or deliberately stretched in coercive settings. A person can be called obsessive, schizophrenic, psychotic, dangerous, and needs help in the same breath, as though these terms all meant the same thing. They do not. In the early DSM period, what is now called OCD appeared under different names. Review literature notes that DSM-I used obsessive-compulsive reaction, DSM-II used obsessive-compulsive neurosis, and the modern criteria-based form of OCD is associated with DSM-III in 1980, when psychiatric diagnosis became more descriptive and operationalized. That shift matters because it shows that older periods relied more on broad interpretive language, while later editions sought more defined criteria. Even under modern classification, OCD is not schizophrenia. OCD is defined by obsessions and compulsions. Schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. They belong to different diagnostic families, with different symptom structures and different implications. Treating them as interchangeable is clinically sloppy at best and manipulative at worst. A person can have compulsive symptoms, repetitive behaviors, anxiety, or distress without being psychotic and without being dangerous. This distinction becomes especially important when discussing trichotillomania. The clinical literature is clear that trichotillomania was not officially included in the DSM until DSM-3R in 1987, when it was classified as an impulse control disorder not elsewhere classified. In DSM-5, it was moved into obsessive-compulsive and related disorders. The same literature emphasizes that trichotillomania, although grouped near OCD in DSM-5, remains distinct from OCD in important ways, including clinical presentation and treatment response. It is therefore not accurate to treat trichotillomania as though it were simply schizophrenia, or simply OCD, or an automatic indicator of dangerousness. That point goes to the heart of how psychological authority can be distorted. If a mild body-focused repetitive behavior can be rhetorically inflated into psychosis, schizophrenia, violence, or needs confinement, the problem is not just diagnostic confusion. The problem is label inflation, the expansion of a limited behavior into a totalizing identity. A limited symptom becomes a broad narrative. A broad narrative becomes a file. A file becomes a mechanism of containment. The psychology community and the social power of interpretation. The psychology and psychiatry community matters in this discussion not because every psychologist or psychiatrist is abusive, but because psychological language has unusual social power. Once a person is spoken of through mental health categories, ordinary people often stop asking ordinary questions. Instead of asking, "What happened?" they ask, "What's wrong with him?" Instead of asking whether a situation involves harassment, shame, misinterpretation, or coercion, they assume that professional-sounding language must reflect underlying truth. That dynamic becomes dangerous when diagnostic language leaves the clinic and enters family systems, schools, workplaces, political discourse, and law enforcement settings. A label that may have a limited clinical meaning can become socially totalizing. The person is no longer simply someone who experiences a symptom or behavior, he becomes that type of person. Once that happens, later actions, reactions, preferences, and emotions can all be reread through the label. If he is quiet, it is pathology. If he is warm, it is suspicious. If he is upset, it confirms the story. If he defends himself, it proves instability. If he withdraws, it shows dysfunction. This is how labels become instruments of containment even outside formal hospitalization. None of this requires claiming that psychology as a field is inherently tyrannical. The point is more sober. Psychological and psychiatric language has a long history of being used not only to describe distress but also to regulate deviance, enforce norms, and justify interventions. The authority of the profession can be socially borrowed, even by non-professionals, in ways that magnify stigma and narrow a target's freedom. Stasi and Zersetson, a documented model of psychological decomposition. One of the strongest historical examples of psychological containment is the Stasi, the secret police of the former East Germany. Britannica describes the Stasi as one of the most hated and feared institutions of the East German communist government. Founded in 1950 in the Soviet zone, it combined domestic surveillance, foreign espionage, repression, and a vast network of informants and unofficial collaborators. At its height, it sought to infiltrate every institution of society and every aspect of daily life, including intimate personal and family relationships. Britannica notes that by 1989 it maintained files on roughly 6 million East Germans, more than one-third of the population. This matters because it proves that deep intrusion into ordinary life is not fantasy. The Stasi did not merely watch dissidents from a distance. It penetrated daily life. It used relationships as informational channels and social pressure points. It blurred the line between public policing and private existence. That is already enough to demolish the naive belief that civilized societies do not mobilize bureaucracy and informant networks against their own populations. The most relevant Stasi concept here is Zersetzung, often translated as decomposition or disintegration. The documented descriptions of Zersetzung emphasize systematic damage to public reputation, the organization of professional and social failure to undermine self-confidence, the creation of doubt about personal perspective, the generation of distrust and suspicion within groups, the exploitation of rivalries, and the disruption of mutual relationships. The means associated with it included anonymous letters, phone calls, rumors, compromising materials, and the use of unofficial collaborators. Even if one disputes a translation nuance, the pattern is plain. The target is not simply watched but psychologically and socially decomposed. That description matters because it is so concrete. Zersetzung was not merely surveillance in the abstract. It was an organized method for breaking a person down socially and psychologically while avoiding the visibility of overt imprisonment. Its logic was to make the target's life unstable, relationships vulnerable, reputation fragile, and sense of self uncertain. If one needs a documented historical example of containment in the negative sense, restriction through destabilization rather than through bars Zersetzen is one of the clearest available. It is also important to be historically precise. The Stasi were not Nazi. They were the secret police of the East German Communist state. The comparison here is tactical, not ideological. Dehumanization, ostracism, and the minute mechanics of psychological containment. This is the part that most needs explanation, because merely naming dehumanization, isolation, or humiliation is too abstract. The reader has to understand how the tactic works on an actual human being, step by step, and why it is so effective. Dehumanization in practice does not always begin with open violence. Often it begins with a subtler move. The target stops being treated as a full person and starts being treated as a category, a problem, a risk, or a thing to manage. Once that happens, ordinary warmth, fairness, curiosity, and reciprocity begin to disappear. The person is no longer approached with, what is happening to him, but with what is he, or, how do we deal with him? That shift is psychologically enormous. It strips away context and replaces it with a controlling narrative. Research on social exclusion and ostracism shows that being ignored or excluded threatens fundamental psychological needs, including belonging, self-esteem, control, meaningful existence, and certainty. At the minute level, the process often works like this. First, the target is classified. The classification can be psychiatric, moral, political, or social, unstable, deviant, suspicious, obsessive, mentally ill, dangerous, disloyal, out of control. The exact label matters less than the function. The function is to create a lens through which all later behavior will be interpreted. Second, the target is socially cooled. People become less warm, less responsive, less spontaneous, more watchful, more guarded. The change may be subtle enough that outsiders think nothing is happening, but strong enough that the target feels it immediately. Third, the target is selectively invalidated. Positive behavior gets no normal reinforcement. Achievements are minimized. Affection is ignored. Neutral acts are treated as odd. Distress is read as evidence. The point is to make the target feel that ordinary humanity no longer works. Fourth, the target is humiliated or belittled, often in ways that are deniable. Humiliation is especially damaging because it is not merely private pain, it is pain in the eyes of others. It attacks the person's status and dignity and can rapidly convert embarrassment into rage, collapse, self-doubt, or withdrawal. Fifth, the target is provoked. This is critical. The system is not satisfied with a quiet target, it often wants a reaction. Why? Because reactions can be harvested. A person who has been ignored, slighted, embarrassed, or stressed for long enough may eventually show anger, agitation, or despair. Once that happens, the provocation itself disappears from view, and the reaction is presented as proof of the target's nature. Sixth, the target becomes trapped in a double bind. If he reacts, he confirms the narrative. If he stays quiet, the system continues. If he withdraws, that becomes dysfunction. If he protests, that becomes instability. If he tries to explain the pattern, he sounds suspicious precisely because the pattern itself is designed to sound unbelievable. The tactic works from the inside out. Instead of simply locking someone in a cell, it makes the world around him unstable. Friendships become uncertain. Reputation becomes fragile. Confidence weakens. The ability to predict how others will respond starts to collapse. The person begins to live in an atmosphere of chronic ambiguity. Who is genuine? Who is reporting? What will be twisted? What normal action will be used against me next? That kind of instability is itself a form of imprisonment, because it shrinks what a person feels safe doing. One of the clearest effects of chronic exclusion and humiliation is damage to self-esteem. When self-esteem is repeatedly attacked, The person starts second-guessing ordinary actions. Should I smile? Should I defend myself? Should I speak? Should I go there? Should I trust this person? Over time, life narrows. The target becomes more cautious, more vigilant, more emotionally exhausted, and often more isolated. That narrowing is one of the clearest forms of containment. Research on ostracism describes not only immediate pain and need threat but longer-term consequences such as alienation, helplessness, and social withdrawal, with self-esteem playing a mediating role. This is also why such tactics are so useful to a coercive system. They can help manufacture the appearance of dangerousness. A friendly, passive, or emotionally normal person may not naturally look threatening. But a person who has been pushed, humiliated, ignored, misread, and deprived of normal social grounding may eventually look agitated, defensive, suspicious, or angry. Once that happens, the system points to the reaction and says, "See? There it is." The prior baiting vanishes. The end product is displayed as if it came out of nowhere. So the tactic is not merely to hurt the person. It is to shape the evidence. It tries to create the very behavior it then cites as justification. That is why the framework of manufactured dangerousness fits so well with the logic of Zersetson. The system produces the symptoms it later claims to diagnose. Another minute-level effect is damage to trust. A person subjected to these tactics starts losing confidence not only in others, but in his own interpretations. Did that slight mean something? Was that delay accidental? Was that insult intentional? Is this friend real? Was that praise sincere? The person lives under chronic uncertainty. That uncertainty is exhausting. It drains cognitive energy, increases vigilance, and makes ordinary social life feel like a minefield. This is one reason the tactic can create the appearance of paranoia without needing to start with psychosis. If a person is repeatedly exposed to ambiguous hostility, rumor, exclusion, and selective invalidation, heightened vigilance becomes understandable. The system can then point to that vigilance as though it were irrational from the start, when in fact it may be a response to sustained destabilization. That is a very important distinction. The tactic also attacks agency and meaningful existence. To be ignored or treated as socially unreal is not just lonely. It attacks the sense that one's presence counts. The person begins to feel less agentic, less impactful, less real in the social world. In longer-term contexts, this can become resignation, a sense that nothing one does will change how one is treated. That is one of the cruelest parts of the tactic. It can push a person toward the edge not only by causing pain, but by making the pain feel socially invisible. In its most effective form, dehumanization does not merely insult a person, it reorganizes the person's body, mind, and social world around chronic threat, while making the resulting distress appear to originate inside the person rather than in the environment imposed on him. Toward the end of this chain, the practical effect is often removal from society without needing a formal sentence. A person whose confidence is broken, whose reputation is unstable, whose reactions are pathologized, and whose attempts at connection are punished may end up increasingly cut off from normal relationships, normal opportunities, and normal participation. In that sense, the social and psychological process begins to perform the same function as exclusion or confinement. The person is not necessarily behind bars, but he is being gradually pushed out of ordinary life. In the American context, this is especially important because it suggests a modern method of exclusion that can coexist with formal legal protections. If outright institutionalization is harder to justify, social and reputational expulsion can still accomplish a similar end. The bodily and mental mechanics of prolonged exclusion, humiliation, and coercive pressure. One of the most important points in this paper is that the harm caused by dehumanization, exclusion, humiliation, and repeated provocation is not only emotional in a vague sense. It is bodily. It is neurological. It is endocrine. It is cognitive. It is behavioral. It is cumulative. A person subjected to these tactics does not merely feel bad. The body begins to absorb the pressure. The mind begins to reorganize around it. The result can be severe anguish, exhaustion, pain sensitization, hypervigilance, impaired self-regulation, and a slow wearing down of the person's ability to function normally in everyday life. This matters because the tactics described in this paper are exactly the kinds of social stressors that can keep a person's stress response systems chronically activated. Chronic humiliation, chronic uncertainty, chronic distrust, repeated social coldness, repeated anticipatory vigilance, and repeated provocation do not simply come and go. They teach the body to remain on alert. They keep the person scanning, bracing, anticipating the next blow, the next insult, the next misinterpretation, the next trap. Over time, this can mean disturbed sleep, muscle tension, headaches, gastrointestinal distress, chronic fatigue, irritability, shakiness, emotional depletion, and the feeling that the body never fully comes back down from alarm. There is also strong evidence that social pain and physical pain overlap in meaningful ways. This matters directly to the kind of containment described here. If a person is repeatedly excluded, shamed, belittled, ignored, or made to feel socially unsafe, the experience can be felt not as a detached idea but as something physically grinding, physically draining, physically painful. It can show up as chest pressure, body heaviness, waves of agitation, loss of appetite, nausea, insomnia, tension, or the sense that one's nervous system is constantly running too hot. That overlap helps explain why repeated social injury may eventually make the whole body feel more brittle and reactive. This is important for the reader because it helps explain why prolonged dehumanization can eventually make someone look worse physically and mentally even when the process began socially. The person is not merely upset in an abstract way. He may be running on chronic physiological overactivation. His attention may narrow. His patience may shorten. His sleep may worsen. His body may hurt more. His threshold for additional stress may drop. The visible deterioration can then itself become part of the evidence against him, even though the deterioration may be partly produced by the environment imposed on him. That is one of the most vicious features of the whole process. The injury becomes the next layer of supposed proof. The mental effects are equally serious. Prolonged exclusion and humiliation can produce a state in which the mind is constantly trying to solve an unstable social puzzle. Who is safe? Who is not? What was meant by that look? Was that delay intentional? Why did that person suddenly change? What am I being set up for? What is about to be twisted next? This kind of vigilance is exhausting. It consumes cognitive bandwidth. It impairs concentration, self-regulation, and decision-making. When enough mental energy is spent on prediction, scanning, and damage control, less is available for ordinary life. The person may then appear scattered, guarded, tense, or overly focused on threat. But what may actually be visible is the cost of prolonged adaptation to instability. On a more intimate level, prolonged humiliation and coldness can alter how a person experiences his own humanity. When warmth is repeatedly not returned, when normal self-expression is treated as suspicious, and when efforts at connection are met with social frost or mockery, the person may begin to numb himself as a survival response. That numbing can look like apathy or lack of feeling from the outside. But the inner truth may be the opposite. The person is not empty because he feels nothing. He is flattening because feeling fully has become too costly. Chronic invalidation can teach the mind to reduce outward expression as a shield. That reduction is not health. It is adaptation to injury. The same process can also produce the opposite response in some periods, not numbness but overload. If the body has been loaded with stress and the mind has been cornered into chronic vigilance, then even a relatively small additional shove may produce a disproportionately intense reaction. This does not prove that the person is naturally violent or disordered. It may instead show that the person has been held under pressure for too long. In that sense, the tactic can create an unstable oscillation between numbness and overactivation, one period of flattening, one period of agitation, one period of withdrawal, one period of visible anger. For a hostile observer, every phase can be used against the person. For a serious reader, the pattern should instead raise the question of what sustained environment could produce those oscillations. The practical consequence is that a person under this kind of prolonged coercive environment may begin to physically and mentally give out. The phrase is not melodrama. It can mean reduced stamina, reduced tolerance for stress, chronic bodily pain, difficulty sleeping, difficulty thinking clearly, emotional collapse, loss of confidence, and a shrinking social world. If that process continues long enough, it can become indistinguishable from a broader removal from society. The body is too tired. The mind is too overloaded. Social trust is too damaged. Ordinary life becomes too punishing. These tactics should therefore be understood not merely as rude, mean, or unpleasant. They are a method of inflicting sustained human pain and then converting the effects of that pain into the rationale for further containment. Why containment in practice tends toward removal from society. One of the most important points in this paper is that containment is not merely about emotional pain. It is about social outcome. The mechanism is psychological, but the end point is often practical exclusion, reduced standing, reduced trust, reduced opportunity, reduced participation, reduced credibility, reduced social contact, reduced employability, reduced ability to defend oneself, and in the most severe cases, effective removal from ordinary civic life. A person does not need to be formally locked in an institution for a containment process to work. If the person's reputation is poisoned, reactions are harvested as proof, relationships are destabilized, and ordinary social participation becomes chronically unsafe, then society itself begins to function like a distributed containment structure. The walls are no longer brick walls, they are relational, reputational, bureaucratic, and psychological. This point becomes even clearer beside the history of psychiatric deinstitutionalization. Once large-scale long-term confinement became less central, the question did not magically become whether coercion had disappeared. The real question became whether older control instincts would reappear in other forms. If outright warehousing becomes harder, then reputational damage, records, behavioral flags, informal exclusion, and the manufacture of dangerousness become more useful. In that sense, removal from society can become more dispersed, more deniable, and more socially embedded. In the American context, many people still imagine repression in crude terms: police batons, prison bars, secret dungeons, or formal psychiatric commitments. But the more modern and socially survivable form of containment may be quieter, make the person harder to trust, harder to defend, harder to hire, harder to include, harder to believe, and harder to interpret outside an imposed frame. If that happens consistently enough, the person can be pushed to the margins of society without any dramatic legal proceeding at all. He becomes socially processed rather than formally sentenced. That is why the issue cannot be reduced to whether there is a court order or institutional commitment on paper. The practical question is whether the person is being gradually removed from full participation in ordinary life. COINTELPRO, the American record of covert disruption. The United States has its own documented history of domestic disruption. The FBI's official vault states that COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, began in 1956 to disrupt the activities of the Communist Party USA, later expanded to other domestic groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Socialist Workers' Party, and the Black Panther Party, and ended in 1971. The FBI also notes that COINTELPRO was later criticized by Congress and the public for abridging First Amendment rights and for other reasons. Vault.fbi.gov. COINTELPRO is not identical to Zersetsen, but it serves a parallel function in this paper. It establishes that American institutions have not always confined themselves to neutral law enforcement. The historical record includes infiltration, disruption, provocation, and attempts to weaken domestic groups through covert means. This matters because many readers instinctively assume that coordinated destabilization is a foreign or authoritarian phenomenon only. COINTELPRO proves that the American state also has a documented record of using covert techniques against domestic targets. Vault.fbi.gov. Once that historical fact is admitted, the comforting argument, "this sort of thing cannot happen here," becomes much weaker. The real question is no longer whether systems of covert disruption can exist in the United States. They already have. Vault.fbi.gov. Soviet punitive psychiatry and the political use of diagnosis. The Soviet case adds another crucial dimension: the political abuse of psychiatric classification itself. The history of sluggish schizophrenia is significant because it shows that diagnosis can be stretched beyond careful medicine and turned into a social or political instrument. The importance of that history is not merely that one regime misused one diagnosis. It is that psychiatry, when merged with state priorities and ideological conformity, can become a tool for pathologizing inconvenient people. That example should make any reader more cautious about the social use of diagnostic language. A diagnosis does not become harmless simply because it sounds medical. When labels are stretched, moralized, or detached from careful clinical boundaries, they can become instruments of silencing, discrediting, and confinement. Soviet punitive psychiatry is a historical warning that the line between care and control can be deliberately blurred. Earlier precedents: the Spanish Inquisition and the long history of coercive labeling. The pattern discussed in this paper did not begin in the 20th century. Much older systems also relied on moralized labeling, social suspicion, secretive procedure, coerced confessions, and the conversion of accusation into bureaucratic power. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, was ostensibly created to combat heresy, but Britannica notes that in practice it served to consolidate power in the monarchy. Britannica also explains that accused persons often had no meaningful defense, were frequently ignorant of the charges, and confessions were often obtained through coercion, confiscation of property, or torture. Sentences were then announced in elaborate public spectacles such as the auto da fe. The relevance of the Inquisition here is not that it was psychiatric in a modern sense. It was not. Its relevance is structural. It shows a much older pattern in which a target is defined as dangerous, impure, or socially contaminating. Ordinary protections are weakened, accusation acquires institutional force, and coercion is wrapped in righteous language. That pattern: classification, moral suspicion, procedural imbalance, and public degradation did not vanish with medieval religion. It reappears in modern forms whenever institutions define a person less as a citizen or patient and more as a problem to be neutralized. South Korea and the persistence of anti-dissent control. South Korea is relevant, not because it was identical to East Germany, but because it provides another documented example of a formally anti-communist state that used security institutions and authoritarian political structures to suppress dissent and broaden state control. Britannica notes that Park Chung-hee took power after a 1961 coup and that the Yushin Constitution of 1972 dramatically increased presidential powers and created a virtual dictatorship. Britannica also describes the Gwangju Uprising of 1980 as a mass protest against South Korea's military government that was brutally repressed. South Korea's intelligence and security apparatus also forms part of this pattern. Britannica explains that what is now the National Intelligence Service was previously the KCIA and later the Agency for National Security Planning, reflecting a long continuity of national security intelligence institutions in South Korea's anti-communist state structure. That point matters because it reinforces a recurring historical truth: once a system learns to organize itself around suspicion, internal enemies, and narrative control, the legal or constitutional surface may change faster than the habits beneath it. Formal modernization does not automatically dissolve older security instincts. What is missing from ordinary education? One reason these patterns remain hard for the public to recognize is that many people were never meaningfully taught them. In ordinary U.S. schooling, students are commonly taught the founding narrative of the country, the Revolution, the Constitution, the separation of powers, the Bill of Rights, and the language of liberty, but are far less likely to be taught a sustained history of domestic surveillance, psychiatric overreach, covert disruption programs, or the mechanics of modern administrative categorization. That gap matters. If people learn freedom mainly as a civic ideal, but not the repeated historical ways institutions have narrowed, rooted, classified, or surveilled people in practice, then they grow up with a false sense that such systems belong only to distant dictatorships or to the past. That ignorance becomes one of the quiet protections of modern containment. This is especially relevant for younger generations. People born after 2001 grew up after the Patriot Act, after the normalization of large digital platforms, and after a major expansion of state and corporate data collection. Many of them know the language of mental health, support, and care, but may have little practical historical memory of older asylum logic, the abuse of psychiatric categories, or the long continuity between classification and control. If those histories are not taught directly, then the public will tend to assume that modern intervention systems are automatically humane simply because they use newer language. That assumption is one of the conditions under which older control instincts survive. Many people are taught the ideals of American freedom, but not the recurring history of American surveillance, coercive classification, psychiatric overreach, and state systems that narrow liberty while speaking in the language of protection. FISA, the legal architecture behind secret intelligence collection. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, provides part of the legal architecture for much of the modern national security surveillance system. Congress enacted FISA in 1978 after revelations of widespread privacy violations by the federal government during the Watergate era. According to the Congressional Research Service, FISA created a statutory framework for government agencies to obtain authorization for foreign intelligence collection through electronic surveillance, physical searches, pen register and trap and trace devices, and compelled production of certain records. It also created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court of Review, FISC, specialized courts that typically hear the government's submissions ex parte, without the ordinary adversarial structure seen in public criminal proceedings. That matters because FISA sits exactly at the intersection this paper is concerned with: secrecy, classification, state attention, and the narrowing of public visibility. Even if many readers have heard the term, they often do not realize that FISA is not just one statute among many. It is a core legal framework through which surveillance, secrecy, and intelligence collection become routinized and judicially processed outside normal public scrutiny. The very existence of a specialized secret court changes the structure of accountability. It does not prove abuse in every case, but it makes abuse or overreach harder for the public to evaluate in real time because the system is designed to operate largely outside ordinary public view. This is one reason FISA belongs in the same paper as the Patriot Act and the NSA disclosures. The Patriot Act expanded and altered surveillance powers in the post-9/11 period, but FISA is part of the deeper institutional scaffolding that made long-term secret intelligence practices legally processable. In that sense, FISA helps explain how a state can continue telling the public that everything is lawful and court-supervised while the public remains largely unable to see the actual operational scope of what is being authorized. The legal form can remain intact while the underlying reality grows broader than most citizens understand. FISA matters not only because it authorizes foreign intelligence collection, but because it normalizes a structure in which surveillance can be legally approved, judicially processed, and publicly obscured at the same time. NSA, Snowden, metadata, and the shift from targeted surveillance to full-spectrum digital monitoring. The National Security Agency, NSA, the Snowden disclosures exposed far more than a phone record program. They showed that the US government had built a surveillance architecture capable of collecting, searching, and analyzing broad layers of digital life. The public first focused on the Section 215 bulk telephone metadata program called Carnivore, but the 2013 disclosures quickly widened to include PRISM, upstream-style interception, large-scale address book harvesting, cell phone geolocation collection, and search systems such as XKeyscore that let analysts query vast stores of Internet-derived data. Major reporting in 2013 described PRISM as a Section 702 mechanism for obtaining data from major U.S. Internet companies, Muscular as secret collection from links between data centers, and XKeyscore as covering nearly everything a typical user does on the Internet. That matters because the NSA story was never just about who called whom. It became a story about the government's ability to map relationships, routines, contact networks, browsing patterns, communication habits, and digital association at scale. Metadata was not trivial. It was a way of reconstructing social structure and behavioral pattern without needing the content of every communication. And once internet collection, platform access, infrastructure interception, contact list harvesting, and location analysis are all viewed together, the issue is no longer telephone records. The issue is a state architecture that can search, sort, and reconstruct large parts of a person's digital life while publicly describing itself in far narrower terms. The Snowden archive also showed that the NSA's power was not only passive. Reporting based on the documents described offensive capabilities, including infrastructure exploitation, implants, and tools for entering networks rather than merely observing them. That distinction matters because it shows the system was not limited to listening. It included capabilities for access, persistence, and network-level influence. In historical terms, that reinforces the main point of this paper. Control systems are rarely introduced in their deepest form. They are justified under a narrow story, while the operational reality grows larger than the public was led to imagine. The significance of the NSA disclosures is not merely that the government collected phone records, but that the Snowden archive revealed a much broader architecture of internet surveillance, metadata analysis, platform access, infrastructure interception, geolocation tracking, and cyber capability that had never been presented to the public in plain terms. The NSA is a system of flagging, selection, and concentrated attention. The NSA is also important because the architecture functioned not only as a collection system, but as a system of selection, querying, and prioritization. Massive data collection by itself is not the whole story. Once enough data exists, the deeper question becomes, what gets queried, what repeats, what correlates, what appears anomalous, and who should be examined more closely. That is the practical logic of flagging, even if the public language around it sounds more technical or bureaucratic. The state does not merely store. It sorts significance. That point connects directly to the broader theme of categorization in this paper. A flagging system does not need to announce itself as a social or psychological classification machine to behave like one. If it is built to elevate patterns, selectors, or anomalies for further attention, then it is already doing the first stage work of distinction: who blends into the background, who stands out, and who becomes worthy of focused scrutiny. In modern surveillance systems, that distinction is one of the most consequential forms of covert power. A person does not need to know he has been flagged for the consequences of being flagged to matter. A modern surveillance system does not merely collect, it selects, sorts, and concentrates attention, which is why flagging is one of the clearest practical descriptions of how mass data becomes individualized state focus. What can and cannot be said about psychology and intelligence? There is no public black and white proof in the sources reviewed that the NSA officially ran a declared joint program with the psychology community for the purpose of identifying who is crazy, or formally integrating psychiatric labels into NSA workflows. That claim would go beyond the evidence. But it is also true that the public record does not need to contain such an admission for the broader historical concern to remain serious. What is documented is that the intelligence community is actively modernizing how it integrates and uses data. ODNI's Intelligence Community Data Strategy 2023-2025 explicitly says the goal is to make intelligence data more interoperable, discoverable, and artificial intelligence ready for both people and machines across all 18 IC elements. That does not prove a hidden psychiatric targeting program. It does show that the U.S. intelligence system is building more scalable ways of sorting, integrating, and operationalizing information. In historical perspective, it is therefore reasonable to worry that these systems can reinforce broader cultures of categorization, anomaly detection, and suspicion even where the public record does not openly state every layer of how that may happen. Edward Snowden did not present the NSA story as a psychiatric story. He presented it as a surveillance story. But the broader historical concern remains that systems of mass monitoring, selection, and anomaly-focused attention can easily intersect with older social instincts about danger, deviance, instability, and the fear of unknown or non-conforming people. The public record does not prove a formal merger between the NSA and the psychology community for that purpose. It does, however, prove that the US government built very large systems for collection, querying, and prioritization, while continuing to modernize its data and analytic capacity. In historical perspective, that makes it reasonable to worry about how such systems can reinforce wider cultures of categorization and suspicion. Why it is not naive to think the architecture continued in new forms. It would be naive to assume that the surveillance architecture exposed in 2013 simply disappeared once it became controversial. Since then, the intelligence community has continued issuing transparency reports, continued operating under FISA authorities, and continued seeking renewed statutory authority from Congress. Section 702 was reauthorized in 2024. ODNI continues publishing public material about transparency, legal authorities, and data strategy. That is enough to show that the basic architecture of national security surveillance persisted beyond the public shock of 2013. That does not prove that every capability remains exactly the same, nor that every old tool is still operating under the same name. But history suggests the deeper lesson: surveillance systems evolve rather than disappear. Authorities are revised. Technologies improve. Interfaces change. Machine capacity increases. Oversight language expands. The appetite for anticipatory knowledge rarely vanishes. In that sense, the burden of common sense runs in the opposite direction from complacency. The history of the American state gives little reason to assume that once a major intelligence capability exists, it simply dissolves because public outrage briefly flared. AI, machine readiness, and the 2026 problem. By 2026, the question is not only what the government could do with phone and internet data in 2013. The question is what a surveillance and intelligence apparatus can do when its own public strategy says its data must be made AI ready. ODNI's 2023 data strategy says exactly that. The intelligence community is working to make data more interoperable, discoverable, and artificial intelligence ready. This is not a speculative conspiracy claim. It is a public strategic statement by the US intelligence system. That matters because AI changes scale. It changes how quickly patterns can be detected, how cheaply data can be triaged, how broadly anomalies can be surfaced, and how much information can be made operational without a human starting from scratch each time. Public documents do not prove every hidden use of AI in national security systems, and I do not claim otherwise. But they do confirm that the intelligence community is modernizing around data integration, interoperability, and machine-usable analytic capacity. In historical perspective, that makes it difficult to treat the surveillance question as closed, old, or safely contained in the post-Snowden past. By 2026, the issue is no longer only what the government could do with telephone and internet records in 2013. The issue is what a surveillance and intelligence apparatus can do when its own data strategy is explicitly designed to be machine-readable, interoperable, and AI-ready. Benevolent language and coercive application. One of the most consistent features of control systems is that they do not usually describe themselves in openly coercive terms. They present themselves as protective, therapeutic, necessary, or socially responsible. State surveillance is justified as national security. Court intervention is justified as treatment. Psychiatric expansion is justified as care. Public order policies are justified as compassion for those in crisis. The language is almost always benevolent on the surface. That is one reason such systems are difficult for the public to recognize in real time. By the time the deeper reality becomes visible, the policy or institution has already been normalized. The historical examples discussed in this paper fit that pattern. The Stasi did not publicly present itself as a machine for psychological decomposition. COINTELPRO was not publicly rolled out as a program for destabilizing domestic targets. Post 9/11 U.S. surveillance expansion was justified in the language of terrorism prevention and emergency necessity, not in the language of mass suspicion. California's behavioral health expansion is framed in the language of care, housing, recovery, and accountability. The public-facing story is almost always softer than the real operational question: how much power of classification, intervention, and control is being created, and how far can it travel beyond the sympathetic case used to justify it publicly. That pattern matters because current behavioral health and public order language often presents itself as if it applies only to the most visibly deteriorated, unsupported, or street-destitute cases. But systems built in that language do not necessarily remain confined to that image. In my own account, I was not homeless, not unsupported, not uneducated, and not outside society in the way these public narratives often imply. I come from a white-collar background, attended college, and started my own company. Yet I believe the same underlying containment logic was applied to me through labeling, provocation, and the construction of dangerousness. That is precisely why the public image of, "we are only helping the most desperate people," is insufficient protection. Once a system is built around classification, intervention, and behavioral control, the practical reach can extend beyond the sympathetic public story used to justify it. This is why the difference between stated purpose and actual use must remain central. A policy can be introduced under a compassionate rationale and still become a tool for categorization, coercion, and expanded control. A system can say it exists for people in acute need while still being used more broadly against people who do not fit that public image. History shows that once powers of surveillance, classification, and intervention are built, they tend to outrun the narrow scenario used to sell them. That is one of the clearest recurring lessons across the Stasi, COINTELPRO, post-9/11 surveillance, and modern behavioral governance systems. California, Newsom, Care Court, and the visible return of stronger control tools. California is a strong present-day example of how a society can move back toward stronger behavioral control mechanisms while still presenting those mechanisms as reforms. Under Governor Gavin Newsom, the state has advanced care court, conservatorship reform, and large-scale behavioral health infrastructure expansion. In 2023, Newsom signed SB 43, describing it as modernizing conservatorship law for the first time in more than 50 years. In 2024, the governor's office described care court as allowing petitions to local courts to help people with untreated schizophrenia spectrum or psychotic disorders get treatment and housing. In 2025 and 2026, the administration tied Proposition 1 and related funding to thousands of new treatment beds and tens of thousands of outpatient treatment slots, and in March 2026 it framed new accountability measures as part of a strategy to get chronically mentally ill Californians off our streets and into treatment. These policies may be defended as compassionate and necessary, and in some cases people will sincerely believe that is exactly what they are. The key point is structural. California is clearly expanding the state's behavioral health machinery, not shrinking it. It is increasing court involvement, increasing conservatorship reach, increasing treatment capacity, and explicitly tying mental illness, homelessness, public order, and state intervention together. That does not amount to a simple return to the asylum era. But it does show that the old appetite for categorization, compelled processing, and expanded authority over mentally classified persons remains active under modern language. California's current behavioral health agenda does not openly advertise a return to the old asylum era, but it clearly documents a renewed institutional willingness to deepen court involvement, conservatorship reach, and treatment rooting authority in the name of care, accountability, and public order. Reform and backlash. Why institutional appetite for control does not simply disappear. It would be inaccurate to say that psychiatry and mental health law did not reform. They did. Deinstitutionalization is real. Supreme Court standards are real. Modern diagnostic systems are more operationalized than older ones. Oversight and civil liberties language are more explicit than they once were. Those reforms matter. But reform is not the same as universal agreement. Institutions are not monolithic, and legal change does not mean that every actor inside government, policing, medicine, or psychology suddenly embraces the new limits in good faith. History repeatedly shows the opposite. Reform often produces adaptation, resentment, workarounds, and informal circumvention. That is true in surveillance law, intelligence practice, police culture, and mental health systems alike. The form changes. The appetite for control may not. Post 9/11 surveillance expansion and California's modern behavioral health agenda are both contemporary examples of that broader tension. That tension is crucial. A society can reform its asylum laws and still tolerate coercive informal tactics. It can condemn older authoritarian methods and still build powerful surveillance systems. It can publicly endorse liberty while privately expanding mechanisms of monitoring, interpretation, and suspicion. History becomes most dangerous not when it repeats itself identically, but when it adapts itself to new language. Why containment tends toward removal from society and cumulative overload. Containment is not an accident. It is not a misunderstanding. It is not a regrettable side effect of concern. Its motive is reduction, neutralization, and removal. The purpose is to cut a person down until he is smaller, weaker, less believable, less defended, less connected, less employable, less loved, less safe, and eventually less present in the life around him. The ideal outcome is not simply that the target suffers. The ideal outcome is that the target becomes easier to dismiss, easier to control, easier to isolate, and easier to erase. That is the motive people often refuse to say out loud. They say they are worried. They say they are helping. They say they want peace, safety, treatment, order, or normalcy. But the actual function of containment is not care. The actual function is to remove an unwanted person from meaningful participation in ordinary life without having to openly admit that removal is the goal. It is expulsion disguised as concern. It is social execution disguised as management. It is the destruction of a person's place in the world disguised as a response to his supposed defects. Also known as stalking. Premeditation to make a human being disappear no matter what it takes. That is why containment does not need a locked institution to succeed. A person does not need to be physically imprisoned if his reality can be poisoned. If his reputation is contaminated, if his reactions are harvested as proof, if his relationships are destabilized, if his motives are constantly rewritten, if his efforts to defend himself are treated as evidence of guilt, and if ordinary participation becomes dangerous, then society itself begins doing the work of the jailer. The prison no longer needs bars. The prison becomes human beings, paperwork, whispers, glances, records, labels, exclusions, evasions, and the permanent implication that this person is not safe, not normal, not credible, not welcome. My father, Dr. Ronald Perelman MD, states, "You know what you did," with no actual answer. This is what makes containment more sinister than open punishment. Open punishment at least admits hostility. Containment hides the hostility inside moral language. It says, "We are concerned. We are cautious. We are only responding. We are only protecting others." But behind that language is a simpler motive. This person must be diminished. His standing must be lowered. His confidence must be broken. His support must be thinned out. His opportunities must be narrowed. His life must be made harder to live. His ordinary humanity must be recoded as abnormal, burdensome, dangerous, or shameful. The motive is not just to hurt. The motive is to convert the target into a social problem. Once that is done, everything else becomes easier. Friends pull back. Employers hesitate. Strangers recoil. Authorities become more willing to listen to distortions. Institutions become more comfortable doing nothing. The target loses the benefit of normal interpretation. He is no longer treated as a person who may have been wronged. He is treated as a person around whom wrong can be rationalized. That is the real power of containment. It shifts the moral burden off the perpetrators and onto the person being broken down. This is why containment naturally tends toward removal from society. A person under sustained containment is not merely insulted or stressed. He is progressively stripped of the conditions that make normal social existence possible. Trust erodes. Defenses weaken. Reputation fractures. Social participation becomes risky. Work becomes harder. Relationships become unstable. Self-expression becomes dangerous. Every human interaction becomes a possible trap, and every reaction becomes usable against him. Under those conditions, the target is not simply living with conflict. He is being forced into a shrinking corridor of existence where withdrawal, collapse, exclusion, or disappearance become increasingly likely outcomes. And that shrinking is the point. The system does not need to announce, "We are removing you from society." It only needs to make society progressively uninhabitable for you. It only needs to make employment fragile, relationships unsafe, public presence uncomfortable, defense self-incriminating, and ordinary warmth suspicious. Once enough pressure points are in place, the target begins to disappear in practical terms even while remaining physically alive. He is there, but he is not permitted full standing. He is present, but not protected. Visible, but not heard. Alive, but not allowed normal life. That is a form of civil erasure. This is also why the paper question cannot be reduced to whether there is a psychiatric commitment order, a jail sentence, or a formal legal declaration. That is far too shallow. The real question is whether a human being is being systematically converted into an exile within his own society. Can he speak without distortion? Can he work without sabotage? Can he trust ordinary contact? Can he form relationships without contamination? Can he defend himself without his defense being weaponized? Can he exist in public without being pushed, framed, baited, or interpreted through a pre-written script? If not, then containment is already functioning, whether or not any institution has signed its name. At its darkest, containment is a method of producing slow social death. Not necessarily immediate physical death, though physical decline can follow. Not necessarily formal disappearance, though disappearance may be the wish. Its genius is that it can destroy a person's life while preserving plausible deniability for everyone involved. The target is harassed until he is distressed, then his distress is cited as proof. He is isolated until he withdraws, then his withdrawal is cited as proof. He is provoked until he reacts, then his reaction is cited as proof. He is denied normal dignity, then his damage is recited as evidence that he never had normal dignity to begin with. The machine creates the wound and then names the wound as character. That is the motive in its naked form, not healing, not understanding, not justice, not order. The motive is to break continuity between the target and the society around him until he becomes easier to expel, easier to bury, easier to discredit, easier to institutionalize, easier to ruin, or easier to let die. Whether the language used is psychiatric, moral, political, familial, or bureaucratic, the end point is the same. The person must be made smaller until his removal looks natural, deserved, or inevitable. That is why containment is so dangerous. It is not just cruelty. It is not just harassment. It is a method for manufacturing consent around a person's exclusion. It trains the surrounding world to participate in the target's destruction while feeling justified, cautious, or innocent. And once that process is far enough along, the target is no longer fighting one insult or one accusation. He is fighting a whole environment that has been taught to treat his continued existence as the problem. Framing, surveillance, and education sections. Many people are taught the ideals of American freedom, but not the recurring history of American surveillance, coercive classification, psychiatric overreach, and state systems that narrow liberty while speaking in the language of protection. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, should be defined clearly in the paper because it provides the legal architecture for much of the modern national security surveillance system. Congress enacted FISA in 1978 after revelations of widespread privacy violations by the federal government during the Watergate era. According to the Congressional Research Service, FISA created a statutory framework for government agencies to obtain authorization for foreign intelligence collection through electronic surveillance, physical searches, pen register and trap and trace devices, and compelled production of certain records. It also created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, FISC, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court of Review, FISC, specialized courts that typically hear the government's submissions ex parte, meaning without the ordinary adversarial structure seen in public criminal proceedings. FISA matters not only because it authorizes foreign intelligence collection, but because it normalizes a structure in which surveillance can be legally approved, judicially processed, and publicly obscured at the same time. NSA, Snowden, and full-spectrum digital monitoring. The National Security Agency, NSA, needs to remain a major section in the paper because the Snowden disclosures revealed far more than a phone record program. They exposed a surveillance architecture concerned with phone metadata, internet data, selectors, relationship mapping, and large-scale machine-usable analysis. ODNI's own materials after 2013 confirm that the intelligence community continues to operate major surveillance authorities and publish transparency reports around them, while Congress reauthorized key powers such as Section 702 in 2024 rather than ending them. That is enough to show that the surveillance question did not close in 2013. It was contested, revised, and partially exposed, but core authorities persisted. The strongest point for this paper is not that every disclosed NSA capability can be perfectly mapped in public today. The strongest point is that Snowden established a durable historical lesson: the US government can build large systems of monitoring, querying, and analysis while publicly describing them in much narrower and more reassuring terms. What begins as terrorism prevention or foreign intelligence can expand into a far broader architecture of association mapping, digital triage, and concentrated attention. That is why the NSA section is so important to the larger argument about containment. It shows how a modern democratic state can normalize wide-scale observation without presenting itself to the public as a society of generalized suspicion. One of the most important ways to describe the NSA architecture for the purposes of this paper is as a system of flagging, selection, and concentrated attention. Massive data collection by itself is not the whole story. Once enough data exists, the deeper question becomes: what gets queried, what repeats, what correlates, what appears anomalous, and who should be examined more closely. That is the practical logic of flagging, even if the public language around it sounds more technical or bureaucratic. The state does not merely store. It sorts significance. A modern surveillance system does not merely collect, it selects, sorts, and concentrates attention, which is why flagging is one of the clearest practical descriptions of how mass data becomes individualized state focus. This paper should keep a careful line here. There is no public black and white proof in the sources reviewed that the NSA officially ran a declared joint program with the psychology community for the purpose of identifying who is crazy or formally integrating psychiatric labels into NSA workflows. That claim would go beyond the evidence. But it is also true that the public record does not need to contain such an admission for the broader historical concern to remain serious. Edward Snowden did not present the NSA story as a psychiatric story. He presented it as a surveillance story. But the broader historical concern remains that systems of mass monitoring, selection, and anomaly-focused attention can easily intersect with older social instincts about danger, deviance, instability, and the fear of unknown or non-conforming people. The public record does not prove a formal merger between the NSA and the psychology community for that purpose. It does, however, prove that the US government built very large systems for collection, querying, and prioritization, while continuing to modernize its data and analytic capacity. In historical perspective, that makes it reasonable to worry about how such systems can reinforce wider cultures of categorization and suspicion. By 2026, the issue is no longer only what the government could do with telephone and internet records in 2013. The issue is what a surveillance and intelligence apparatus can do when its own data strategy is explicitly designed to be machine-readable, interoperable, and AI-ready. Education, ignorance, and why people do not recognize the pattern. One reason these systems remain hard for the public to recognize is that many people were never taught them in any meaningful way. In ordinary US schooling, students are commonly taught the founding narrative of the country, the Revolution, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the language of liberty, but are far less likely to be taught a sustained history of domestic surveillance, psychiatric overreach, covert disruption programs, the mechanics of secret intelligence law, or the historical use of classification as a form of control. That gap matters. If people learn freedom mainly as a civic ideal, but not the repeated historical ways institutions have narrowed, rooted, classified, or surveilled people in practice. Then they grow up with a false sense that such systems belong only to distant dictatorships or the distant past. That is one reason this paper has to teach history before it applies it to my life. If readers do not understand that states and institutions have long histories of classifying, isolating, monitoring, and processing problematic people, then they will interpret modern systems of behavioral framing, intervention, and surveillance as harmless routine. But if they do understand that history, then they can begin to see why modern categorization is never just clerical. It is often a first-stage act of containment. Provocation, overload, end state. This paper uses the term containment as a broad interpretive concept for that pattern. The point is not that one historical actor coined the word in exactly this negative sense. The point is that there is a recognizable social and political method by which a person's life is narrowed through labeling, humiliation, provocation, isolation, surveillance, and social management. In that sense, containment means not emotional support but coercive restriction, the making of a smaller life or removal from society of a targeted person. The historical record also shows that coercive systems rarely present themselves as cruelty. They present themselves as necessity. They say they are preserving order, protecting society, preventing danger, defending morality, treating pathology, or managing risk. Many people assume oppression must look theatrical, openly violent, or foreign. In reality, some of its most durable forms work indirectly, through classification, stigma, emotional baiting, rumor, professional authority, surveillance, and the manipulation of how a person is perceived by others. The injury can be real even when the outer surface looks bureaucratic, procedural, or reasonable. To understand modern psychological containment, it helps to begin with the older psychiatric system. Britannica notes that U.S. state hospital populations later fell from just under 560,000 in 1955 to just over 130,000 in 1980 as deinstitutionalization progressed. That rise and fall matters because it shows that large-scale psychiatric confinement was once not exceptional at all. It was a routine institutional framework. In the United States, the federal role in mental health also expanded after World War II. The National Mental Health Act of 1946 authorized federal work on mental illness, and NIMH was established in 1949. That history matters because it reflects the increasing institutionalization of mental health knowledge and authority. Psychiatry and mental health administration did not remain small or local, they became more systematized, more bureaucratically connected, and more influential in public life. One point is essential. OCD is not schizophrenia. Trichotillomania is not schizophrenia. A mild body-focused repetitive behavior is not psychosis. When such things are rhetorically inflated into a totalizing identity, the problem is not careful diagnosis. The problem is label inflation, the expansion of a limited behavior into a broad narrative that then becomes a file, and the file becomes a mechanism of containment. That point matters because once a person is spoken of through mental health categories, ordinary people often stop asking ordinary questions. Instead of asking what happened, they ask what is wrong with him. Instead of asking whether a situation involves harassment, shame, misinterpretation, or coercion, they assume that professional-sounding language must reflect underlying truth. The psychology and psychiatry community matters in this discussion not because every clinician is abusive, but because psychological language has unusual social power. Once a person is framed through mental health categories, family systems, schools, workplaces, police, courts, and community narratives can all begin rereading that person through the label. If he is quiet, it is pathology. If he is warm, it is suspicious. If he is upset, it confirms the story. If he defends himself, it proves instability. If he withdraws, it proves dysfunction. This is how labels become instruments of containment even outside formal hospitalization. From Gestapo to KGB to Stasi, progression in authoritarian method. The progression that matters here is not a single organization under different names, but a regional progression in authoritarian method. The Gestapo belonged to Nazi Germany. The KGB belonged to the Soviet system. The Stasi belonged to Communist East Germany. Those distinctions must remain clear. But it would be equally misleading to ignore the continuity in method, surveillance, informants, denunciations, intimidation, political policing, and the use of fear to regulate everyday life. Britannica's overview of secret police explicitly groups the Gestapo, the KGB, and the Stasi among the most notorious examples of that type of institution. Under Nazi Germany, the Gestapo operated without civil restraints and used preventive arrest, arbitrary searches, intimidation, and extensive denunciations from ordinary people. Britannica notes that the Gestapo relied heavily on denunciations, and the larger Nazi system used public humiliation and social degradation against targeted individuals. This matters because it shows that Nazi rule did not need to begin with a normal criminal process. Society itself could be weaponized as part of control, and an individual could be marked, denounced, humiliated, and isolated through a mix of state power and social collaboration. The Soviet security tradition, culminating in the KGB, developed in a different ideological universe but retained the same broad logic of political policing, surveillance, internal enemies, and the treatment of people as objects of state management. The point for this paper is not that fascism and communism were the same. They were not. The point is that across both, the state repeatedly developed institutions whose purpose was not ordinary law enforcement but political and social control through fear, information, and preemptive suppression. The Stasi then represents a later and more psychologically refined stage of that secret police logic. Britannica states that the Stasi developed out of the internal security apparatus in the Soviet zone after World War II and that its forerunner was modeled on Soviet lines. Within East Germany it sought to infiltrate every institution and every aspect of daily life through an enormous network of informants and unofficial collaborators. That is why the Stasi tactics matters so much to my life. It demonstrates a mature form of authoritarian method in which surveillance, distrust, and social fragmentation become embedded in ordinary life itself. A clean way to state the progression is this: Gestapo denunciations, preventive arrest, humiliation, terror. KGB state surveillance, political policing, internal enemies. Stasi a Soviet-modeled but regionally familiar secret police system that pushed surveillance and social penetration even deeper into everyday life, eventually producing methods like psychological decomposition. The continuity is therefore not one office, but a recurring belief that the state may secretly classify, monitor, intimidate, and manage individuals regarded as dangerous, deviant, or threatening. Stasi and the refinement of psychological decomposition. The Stasi is especially important because it demonstrates a more developed form of psychological containment. Britannica describes the Stasi as infiltrating every institution of East German society in every aspect of daily life, even intimate and family relationships, through official apparatus and a vast network of unofficial collaborators. That alone shows that the target was not merely watched from outside. The target's social world itself became part of the system. The relevance of Zersetzung in this paper is that it captures the logic of psychological decomposition, damage the target's reputation, undermine self-confidence, generate distrust, destabilize relationships, and make daily life structurally unsafe. The goal is not merely to arrest the target after some offense. The goal is to make the target smaller, weaker, more isolated, less credible, and more easily managed. Dehumanization, ostracism, and the minute mechanics of containment. Dehumanization often begins when the target stops being treated as a full person and starts being treated as a category, a problem, a risk, or a thing to manage. Once that happens, ordinary warmth, fairness, curiosity, and reciprocity begin to disappear. The person is no longer approached with, what is happening to him, but with what is he, or, how do we deal with him? That shift is psychologically enormous. It strips away context and replaces it with a controlling narrative. At the minute level, the process often works like this. First, the target is classified. Second, the target is socially cooled. Third, the target is selectively invalidated. Fourth, the target is humiliated or belittled. Fifth, the target is provoked. Sixth, the target is placed in a double bind. If he reacts, he confirms the narrative. If he stays quiet, the pressure continues. That is why the tactic is so destructive. It works from the inside out. Instead of simply locking someone in a cell, it makes the world around him unstable. Friendships become uncertain. Reputation becomes fragile. Confidence weakens. The ability to predict how others will respond starts to collapse. The person begins to live in chronic ambiguity. Who is genuine? Who is reporting? What will be twisted? What normal action will be used against me next? That instability is itself a form of imprisonment. The bodily and mental mechanics of prolonged coercive pressure. The harm caused by dehumanization, exclusion, humiliation, and repeated provocation is not only emotional in a vague sense. It is bodily. It is cognitive. It is behavioral. It is cumulative. A person subjected to these tactics does not merely feel bad. The body begins to absorb the pressure. The mind begins to reorganize around it. The result can be anguish, exhaustion, hypervigilance, pain sensitization, impaired self-regulation, and a slow wearing down of the person's ability to function normally. These tactics teach the body to remain on alert. Chronic humiliation, chronic distrust, chronic uncertainty, repeated social coldness, repeated anticipatory vigilance, and repeated provocation do not simply come and go. They keep the person scanning, bracing, anticipating the next blow, the next insult, the next misinterpretation, the next trap. Over time, this can mean disturbed sleep, muscle tension, non-stop headaches, gastrointestinal distress, fatigue, irritability, shakiness, and emotional depletion. That also helps explain why prolonged dehumanization can eventually make someone look worse physically and mentally even when the process began socially. The person is not merely upset in an abstract way. He may be running on chronic overactivation. Attention narrows. Patience shortens. Sleep worsens. Non-stop the body hurts more. The threshold for additional stress drops. The visible deterioration can then itself become part of the evidence against him, even though it may be partly produced by the environment imposed on him. My father, Dr. Ronald Perelman, MD, states, "You know what you did," with no actual answer. This is also why the question cannot be reduced to whether there is a psychiatric commitment order, a jail sentence, or a formal legal declaration. That is far too shallow. The real question is whether a human being is being systematically converted into an exile within his own society. Can he speak without distortion? Can he work without sabotage? Can he trust ordinary contact? Can he form relationships without contamination? Can he defend himself without his defense being weaponized? Can he exist in public without being pushed, framed, baited, or interpreted through a pre-written script? If not, then containment is already functioning, whether or not any institution has signed its name. At its darkest, containment is a method of producing slow social death. Not necessarily immediate physical death, though physical decline can follow. However, that's when talking about containment, and not an assassination attempt. Not necessarily formal disappearance, though disappearance may be the wish. Its genius is that it can destroy a person's life while preserving plausible deniability for everyone involved. The target is harassed until he is distressed, then his distress is cited as proof. He is isolated until he withdraws, then his withdrawal is cited as proof. He is provoked until he reacts, then his reaction is cited as proof. He is denied normal dignity, then his damage is recited as evidence that he never had normal dignity to begin with. The machine creates the wound and then names the wound as character. That is why containment is so dangerous. It is not just cruelty. It is not just never-ending non-stop stalking and harassment. It is a method for manufacturing consent around a person's exclusion. It trains the surrounding world to participate in the target's destruction while feeling justified, cautious, or innocent. And once that process is far enough along, the target is no longer fighting one insult or one accusation. He is fighting a whole environment that has been taught to treat his continued existence as the problem. cumulative overload and the breaking point. There is also a point that cannot be ignored. The effect of sustained, repeated provocation is not only social or psychological, it is physiological, and it accumulates. If a person experienced distress every day, and it never stopped, and it progressively intensified, the issue would not be any single event. The issue would be the absence of recovery. The human body is not designed to endure continuous activation without interruption. At some point, the system begins to fail under the weight of unrelenting input. The same principle applies here. If provocation is occasional, the person stabilizes. If it is periodic, the person recovers between events. But if it becomes constant minute by minute, interaction by interaction, day after day, then recovery is removed entirely. At that scale, the target is no longer dealing with isolated incidents. He is placed into continuous nervous system activation. Every interaction becomes a stimulus. Repeated behaviors. Verbal harassments. Mimicry. Tone and pattern recognition. Visual cues. Environmental signaling. Coordinated or mirrored actions. Each act may appear insignificant on its own, but at high frequency, over long duration, they form a continuous stream that the nervous system cannot disengage from. This produces cumulative strain. Persistent stress activation without reset. Disruption of sleep and recovery cycles. Degradation of cognitive clarity. Erosion of emotional regulation. Increasing physical fatigue and systemic strain. Over time, this condition is not sustainable. The human system requires intervals of safety and neutrality to maintain function. When those intervals are removed, the system is forced into continuous output without restoration. At sufficient intensity and duration, the outcomes narrow. Physiological breakdown under chronic stress load. Behavioral destabilization from sustained pressure. Collapse or withdrawal as survival responses. Crisis states that may require intervention. This is not theoretical. It is the predictable result of uninterrupted exposure without recovery. The critical variable is volume. One incident can be ignored. Repeated incidents can be endured. But constant, high-frequency provocation sustained over years becomes cumulative biological overload. At that point, the question is no longer whether damage will occur. The question is how long the system can continue before it begins to fail. And that is the final point. When the frequency and intensity are high enough, the process itself drives the person toward breakdown, not through a single act, but through relentless accumulation over time and with clear and obvious premeditation. FISA, secrecy, and the legal architecture of hidden process. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, should be understood as part of the legal architecture through which secrecy, surveillance, and hidden process become routinized. Congress enacted FISA in 1978 after revelations of widespread privacy violations by the federal government during the Watergate era. It created a statutory framework for foreign intelligence collection and created specialized courts, including the FISC and FISC, which normally hear ex parte government submissions. That matters because FISA sits at exactly the intersection this paper is concerned with: secrecy, classification, state attention, and the narrowing of public visibility. It is one of the clearest examples of how a state can continue telling the public that everything is lawful and court-supervised while the public remains largely unable to see the actual operational scope of what is being authorized. The legal form can remain intact while the underlying reality grows broader than most citizens understand. NSA, Snowden, metadata, and full-spectrum digital monitoring. The National Security Agency belongs in this paper because the Snowden disclosures exposed far more than a phone record program, Carnivore. They exposed a surveillance architecture built around collection, querying, and analysis of broad layers of digital life. The public first focused on the Section 215 bulk telephone metadata program, but the disclosures quickly widened to include PRISM, internet collection, and search systems designed to query vast stores of digital data. ODNI's later public strategy documents confirm that the intelligence community continues to prioritize interoperable, discoverable, and AI-ready data across all 18 IC elements. The strongest point here is not that every disclosed NSA capability can be perfectly mapped in public today. The strongest point is that Snowden established a durable historical lesson. The US government can build large systems of monitoring, querying, and analysis while publicly describing them in much narrower and more reassuring terms. What begins as terrorism prevention or foreign intelligence can expand into a broader architecture of association mapping, digital triage, and concentrated attention. This paper must keep a careful line. There is no public black and white proof, and the sources reviewed that the NSA officially ran a declared joint program with the psychology community for the purpose of identifying who is crazy or formally integrating psychiatric labels into NSA workflows. That claim would go beyond the evidence. But what is documented is that the intelligence community is actively modernizing how it integrates and uses data. ODNI's data strategy explicitly says the goal is to make intelligence data interoperable, discoverable, and artificial intelligence ready for both people and machines. That does not prove a hidden psychiatric targeting program. It does show that the US intelligence system is building more scalable ways of sorting, integrating, and operationalizing information. In historical perspective, it is therefore reasonable to worry that these systems can reinforce broader cultures of categorization, anomaly detection, and suspicion even where the public record does not openly state every layer of how that may happen. That pattern matters because systems built in benevolent language do not necessarily remain confined to the narrow public image used to sell them. In my own account, I was not homeless, not unsupported, not uneducated, and not outside society in the way these public narratives often imply. I came from a white-collar background, attended college, jobs in Hollywood, 3D animation/visual effects, computers, IT, programming, web development, graphics layouts, servers/operating systems, and started my own company with some of the predators sent after me growing up, like Michael Patrick Huntley, and another friend since 14 years old, Paul Humphrey, who worked for LAPD and security companies around 1998, luring me back from University of Colorado. Yet I believe the same underlying containment logic was applied to me through labeling, provocation, and the construction of dangerousness, especially with them linked to my family at a very young age with illegal police monitoring. That is why the public image of, "we are only helping the most desperate people," is insufficient protection. California, Newsom, care court, conservatorship, and stronger control tools. Official admission is the least likely form of proof. A central point of this paper is that the kinds of systems being discussed here are not the kinds of systems that openly admit themselves. If the subject is covert surveillance, covert categorization, state-aligned harassment, secret police logic, judicial misuse, or informal containment carried out under color of law, especially with civilian cooperation, then official confession is the least likely form of evidence one should expect. Such systems do not ordinarily produce transparent acknowledgments of misconduct. They do not reduce themselves to one signed paper saying, "Yes, this was done intentionally." That is why this paper does not treat the absence of official admission as meaningful exoneration. The absence of confession from a covert or abusive institution does not weigh heavily in its favor. It is exactly what one would expect. If anything, the history discussed throughout this paper suggests the opposite. Institutions of surveillance, political policing, psychological containment, and coercive classification tend to deny, obscure, sanitize, compartmentalize, or morally invert what they are doing. Publicly, they speak in the language of law, safety, treatment, or necessity. Privately, the machinery can operate very differently. The issue, then, is not whether there is evidence unless the government confesses. The issue is whether a long, dense, consistent body of evidence exists even in the absence of confession. In my account, it does. I do not lack evidence. What I lack is official acknowledgement from the same kinds of institutions I believe were involved, aligned, or protective of what was done. The demand for a perfectly packaged official admission can itself become a shield for systems designed never to produce one. Preventive control, preventive punishment, and the flexing of power. One of the most important points in this paper is that containment is not only reactive, it is often preventive. The target is not necessarily punished for a proven act. The target is often controlled in advance, watched in advance, classified in advance, and pressured in advance. The underlying message is not simply, "You did something wrong." The deeper message is, "We have decided you are the type of person who must be watched, managed, limited, and kept in line before anything even happens." This is why the concept of preventive arrest or preventive control matters so much in the historical comparison. Britannica notes that the Gestapo used preventive arrest, meaning that people could be seized not simply for an ordinary criminal offense proved in public process, but because they were viewed as politically threatening, socially undesirable, or dangerous to the regime. That is important because it shows the underlying motive structure, not neutral justice, but preemptive management of a person already classified as a problem. Once that framework exists, the state no longer needs to wait for a true offense in the ordinary sense. Classification itself begins to justify extraordinary attention. That same broader logic can be seen in later systems, even when the form changes. The Stasi did not need to rely only on visible arrest if it could destabilize, isolate, and decompose a target socially and psychologically. The target lives under a message that is constant even if rarely stated aloud: "We are watching, we are deciding what you mean, and you do not get to move freely outside our imposed interpretation of you." Power through provocation, the command to submit without reacting. Another essential point is that the system does not merely observe. It often flexes. It demonstrates power by applying pressure and demanding that the target absorb it without reaction. In practical terms, that means repeated provocation, humiliation, coldness, intimidation, and daily pressure, followed by the demand that the target remain perfectly composed. The target is baited and then judged for taking the bait. He is pressured and then judged for showing pressure. He is struck psychologically and then judged for showing pain. In that sense, the message is not only, "We can watch you." It is also, "We can keep striking you, and you are not allowed to respond like a human being. You are expected to absorb repeated injuries without protest, without visible anger, without collapse, without fear, and without naming what is happening. If you do react, the reaction becomes proof. If you do not react, the pressure continues." This is what turns containment into domination rather than mere stigma. My life within that structure, the system and those helping it. The relevance of historical patterns to my life. The historical patterns examined in this paper are not just abstract intellectual exercises, they map directly onto the contours of my life. I have lived, for decades, within a structure defined by coercive labeling, patterns of provocation, social pressure, and the steady construction of dangerousness from behaviors that are either ordinary or, in some cases, exaggerated. My personal history, more thoroughly chronicled elsewhere, provides detailed events and dates that anchor these experiences in reality, but my focus here is narrower. My aim is to clarify how the particular tactics I have faced, constant surveillance, reinterpreted behavior, and relentless categorization, are not isolated incidents nor the product of personal paranoia. Rather, they bear a striking resemblance to historically documented strategies, employed in many times and places, whereby institutions isolate, discredit, reinterpret, and ultimately control individuals under a narrative of instability or threat. Preemptive narratives and diagnostic distinctions. A crucial component of this system is the pre-construction of every accusation. I have, over the years, been unofficially labeled and relabeled by random strangers I've never met or taken the time to get to know me: paranoid, violent, schizophrenic, racist, anti-Semitic, a criminal, or otherwise, out of control. What is key here is not just the content of the labels, but their interlocking nature and the manner in which they are deployed. Within this framework, any attempt I make to describe what is occurring, to advocate for myself and point out overarching patterns, is itself seized upon as further evidence that I fit the narrative. For example, if I attempt to speak up about being provoked or stalked by mass groups, I am told my account is proof of paranoia or psychosis. If I object to dishonest behavior, it is labeled as aggression or instability. This is why an accurate understanding of diagnostic distinctions such as the difference between a body-focused repetitive behavior and a psychotic disorder remains absolutely essential. If these distinctions are blurred, then virtually any conduct, even distress in the face of intense provocations, can be repurposed as proof of mental illness or risk. In this way, the door to containment is opened wide, allowing those in power to confine, scrutinize, and control using labels as justifications. The contextual network, patterns, relationships, and coincidence. But what cements the reality of my experience, and sets it apart from random misfortune, is the density and duration of circumstantial context. Across more than 4 decades of life, I have encountered an astonishing number of interlocking coincidences, political ties, cord-connected relationships, professional overlap among adversaries, property disputes, repeated and explicit threats, and daily provocations. This thick pattern is not simply the product of a single incident or one-off misunderstanding. Rather, it is a tapestry that has been woven over years with remarkable persistence. I do not claim to hold a signed confession from a government agency or a videotaped order to target me. Instead, I present the cumulative pattern, one that is too substantial to be explained away as happenstance. While any single coincidence could be dismissed, a prolonged chain of coincidences emerging day after day, and year after year, each pointing in the same direction, becomes something else entirely, not an official document, but a factual reality demanding serious scrutiny and investigation. Personal statements as evidence of systemic discipline. Some of the most direct articulations of this reality have come in the form of statements from long-term acquaintances such as Michael Patrick Huntley, who has known me since adolescence. Huntley, after luring me back to California from the University of Colorado to help start Signity Services, a technology firm, made his position abundantly clear. Statements like, "We are using the judicial system against you," or "You had better live a careful life," and "You're too out of control for California," are not the words of a concerned friend, they echo the language of preventive power. These are not isolated remarks, either. Such warnings have been reinforced by direct police threats such as, "We are watching you, Perelman." These are not descriptive statements, they are disciplinary in nature. They communicate that the institutions around me are reviewing my life through a hostile framework and that there are boundaries arbitrary, externally imposed, which I am expected to respect if I want to avoid reprisal. The underlying message is clear: I am being judged and monitored, and the cost of resisting the narrative is a further ratcheting up of pressure, retaliation, or the orchestration of additional, more damaging allegations. The reversal of accusation and management of morality. A particularly insidious tactic is the reversal of accusation. The same systems and associates that initially imposed a stigmatizing or pathologizing narrative have, when their original claims appeared vulnerable, worked overtime to recast me as racist, anti-Semitic, unstable, hateful, or dangerous. This is not a quest for accuracy, it is a strategy to recode the target as morally contaminated. By doing so, they make it easier for institutions, acquaintances, and even the broader community to justify their continued aggression and for original misconduct to be excused or forgotten. This reversal is about shifting the moral structure so that any response, from defense to distress, is recategorized as evidence of guilt or unfitness. It transforms the target from a subject of abuse into its ostensible perpetrator, muddying the ethical landscape and silencing those who might otherwise recognize the injustice. Ordinary human behavior as manufactured evidence. Perhaps the deepest violation in this system lies in its treatment of ordinary human behavior as incriminating evidence. Across my life, warmth or friendliness has been reframed as suspicious, emotional distress is characterized as clinical pathology, healthy self-defense is twisted into instability, anger after sustained baiting is reclassified as proof of dangerousness, withdrawal after prolonged humiliation is branded as dysfunction. This systematic reframing ensures that no normal human reaction is safe from being misrepresented and filed away as cumulative evidence against me. The dynamic has not faded over time, instead, it has grown more pervasive. The longer I live within this structure, the more I see that the goal is not simply misunderstanding, but methodical containment. I am caught in a situation where all roads lead back to the same prejudged conclusion, that I am in need of constant watch, intervention, or exclusion. Cumulative and lasting harm. The result of this campaign is not simply discomfort or fleeting distress, but a slowly mounting toll that amplifies over decades. A single insult or false accusation might be survivable, maybe even forgettable. But when insults, fabrications, provocations, mislabelings, and orchestrated social cold shoulders happen regularly for nearly 5 decades, oftentimes in a festering atmosphere where narratives of threat or instability are already in place, the consequences escalate far beyond the sum of individual incidents. What occurs is not merely emotional wear and tear, but damage to the very foundations of life. Trust becomes withered, vigilance exhausting, relationships strained, opportunities diminished, and confidence eroded. Day-to-day living is stripped of security. Instead, life becomes a gauntlet where conserving energy, holding back in social situations, and calculating every word in action is a matter of survival. Not only do the authorities and communities involved fabricate false arrest records to fortify their case, but they also seek to retroactively justify themselves by invoking claims that stretch back to when I was barely 5 years old, all as a method of covering up the origins and motivations behind these campaigns. Social exile without formal exclusion. This system excels at pushing one to the margins of society without necessarily resorting to formal institutionalization. There is little need for a courtroom or public spectacle every day. The work is done on subtler grounds socially, emotionally, psychologically, reputationally, and financially. Each day, as participation in ordinary life becomes riskier and the threat of punishment for simple human expression more severe, it becomes easier to push someone out. Externally, this process may later be framed as a personal failing, as if I withdrew, deteriorated, or became difficult. Inwardly, however, I recognize it for what it is. A systematic and relentless campaign of pressure, removing the possibility of ordinary life one day at a time. The most profound danger, imposed identity and preventive control. The ultimate danger is not the risk of being punished for isolated actions, but of being condemned in advance based on an identity defined entirely by outsiders. The state, or those acting with its approval, decides what kind of person I am, and treats that narrative as lifelong justification for scrutiny. The pressure then shifts. It is not about disproving specific allegations, but about disproving a category of personhood I never chose. This is the essence of preventive control, and it is among the purest expressions of systematic containment in a modern setting. The contradiction and persistence of covert containment. The greatest contradiction is that all this occurs not in an openly declared police state, but within the ordinary institutions, psychological vernacular, and legal frameworks of the United States. The presence of lawful institutions, psychiatric labels, and moralized accusations is what makes these campaigns harder to expose. Rather than confessing their aims, these systems thrive on denial, reframing, and shifting the boundaries of meaning. Therefore, the lack of official acknowledgement is itself part of the system and not a sign of institutional innocence. Those who expect a public confession misunderstand how covert surveillance and psychological pressure actually operate. The real question is whether the accumulated density of evidence, the historical echoes, and the visible continuity of conduct are sufficient to prove that this structure exists, regardless of official denial. In my experience, they are. Labeling, categorization, and the state's habit of pre-processing. The institutional need to simplify. Important to this historical account is the role of labeling and categorization in the machinery of containment. There is an enduring tendency, across systems and centuries, for institutions to save time and reduce uncertainty by sorting human beings into simple types. Unlike the complexity of a real person, a category is swift, convenient, and designed for bureaucratic management. Once assigned a label, be it behavioral, risk-based, case code, dispatch status, or mental health frame, a person is no longer greeted as an individual. Instead, each subsequent processor inherits not a blank slate, but a ready-made interpretation. This economization, while efficient for the institution, exacts a heavy human cost. That cost comes from being forever seen as an already processed object, not as a living, developing person. The lasting impact of labels. This is why the act of labeling is never neutral. The label is not simply descriptive.